Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will begin the first session of the webinar in a moment. I would like to invite the Director and Representative of UNESCO Office in Jakarta. Please welcome Professor Shahbaz Khan. Time is yours.
Thank you very much. This is really a wonderful day, and we are so proud to have with us His Excellency Minister Nadiem Makarim, a very dynamic leader, and especially as a champion of the freedom of teaching and freedom of learning, uh, how to enable teachers and students to have more interactive and responsible teaching and learning program. So in this context, this is really the right time for us to interact with His Excellency today. Today, as we know, we are talking about the Global Education Monitoring Report, which has been introduced by Arif Rahman and the leadership of the National Commission of Indonesia for UNESCO, but the Ministry of Education and Culture's overall leadership. Let us just quickly remind ourselves that this particular report is about inclusion and education, and all means all. So while there are many achievements, which we will be hearing from His Excellency, Minister of Education and Culture, in the world there are many difficult challenges as well. The education opportunities continue to be unequally distributed. Barriers to quality education are still very high for learners, as well as the opportunities for the teachers themselves. 1 in 5 children, adolescents, and youth are entirely excluded from education. Stigma, stereotypes, discrimination, those are the challenges which are making millions to be alienated within the classrooms. So that's really serious. And today's session hopefully will help us make sure all education actors widen their understanding, especially through the experience of Ministry of Education and Culture, which has been at the forefront in Indonesia and in the ASEAN. How can we bring education opportunities to all, and especially with Indonesia as an archipelago with so many islands to take all the benefits to everyone. This is really a big achievement, and especially for the quality education, which is also part of our Sustainable Development Goals, Sustainable Development Goal number 4. So let me begin now this session by looking into some of the areas which have been highlighted also in the Global Education Monitoring Report. And one of them is about inclusive education policies. So my question to His Excellency, Minister of Education and Culture, for Nadiem Makarim is how such inclusive education policies are being implemented and translated into action in Indonesia. So all those colleagues who are joining from other countries, they would be very keen to learn from your experience, Your Excellency. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to the UNESCO Director and Country Representative, Professor Dr. Shahbaz Khan. It's quite an honor for me to be here speaking to you. It has been a very tumultuous time in Indonesia at this during this pandemic crisis, and definitely not the least in the field of education, which is experiencing all kinds of crises, both the economic health and of course the educational crises that we are going through because of the mandate to have to close and open schools depending on the health risks that are prevalent today. When we talk about inclusiveness, I think Indonesia is it is a perfect case study to talk about all types of inequality, because what we have in Indonesia is the 4th largest educational system in the world, with the most number of geographical boundaries and challenges, huge discrepancies, not just in infrastructure, but discrepancies in cultural and a variety of cultural heritages and languages and of course the economic barriers. So when we talk about inclusiveness in Indonesia, whereas in many Western countries, when you talk about inclusiveness, you're really talking about disadvantaged students with, say, special needs or learning difficulties. Really, in Indonesia, we're facing, and I think in a lot of large developing countries, we're facing even larger modes of inequality that are happening. So I'll give you one example of this. So previously, we had been running a national exam in Indonesia for many decades. And this national exam, basically, when the latest PISA score came out, it was very surprising to a lot of people, domestically and internationally, to find out that the most well-to-do families and well-to-do students are actually in the public schools. And the vast majority of our private schools are where the lower income households put their children. And, you know, very clearly, what we realize is that this standardized testing mechanism was very much discriminatory to people of lower incomes. And why that was the case is because people of lower incomes could not afford personal tutoring to ace the test. As we all know about standardized tests, it requires personal tutoring to get a higher score. And so the government subsidized schools in Indonesia are all basically were housing the more well-to-do, whereas the private schools where parents have to pay tuition are where the less-to-do. So we had this massive income inequality. So when we're talking about inclusiveness, that was the first thing we tackled first. We eliminated that national exam. That's the first thing we did. And we changed it to a PISA-like test that, instead of evaluating individual students for selection to the next tier of schooling, we changed it into an evaluation for the school. So very much we followed the PISA kind of standard for numeracy literacy. And those tests could not be, you cannot personally tutor yourself on those tests. So this was kind of the great equalizer that we did, the first thing that we did before the pandemic hit. We eliminated the national exam. We changed it next year to the assessment competency, which is like PISA. And then, of course, implemented the zona, what we call zonasi, which is which basically democratized or randomized selection into government middle schools and high schools that was based on geography instead of based on test score. So that was probably one of the biggest barriers to inclusivity that we first attacked. And it was a pretty dramatic change that we implemented. And not everyone was, you know, it wasn't the easiest decision to implement, because for decades, we've been used to this national entrance exams to go into middle schools and high schools that everybody wanted their kids to go to. But it was what was necessary to level the playing field and to enable equal access to people of all income brackets to be able to access public schools. So I think that was one of the most important things that we did. With regard to special needs, the government of Indonesia, we just signed a government regulation number 13, year 2020, about adequate accommodation for students with disabilities. Now, according to this regulation, the provision of adequate accommodation in the field of education is basically make sure that all these students with disabilities are being addressed, their needs are being addressed in the educational institutions. And the implementation of this, even though very complicated, is being carried out at all levels and all types of education, all the way from university, all the way down to elementary school. And in higher education, for example, what we're doing is we have a program that is essentially a social welfare, not social welfare, more like a social scholarship welfare for the poorest, called KIP Kuliah. And we've allocated a KIP Kuliah afirmasi component for persons with disabilities and with other areas from disadvantaged locations around Indonesia. These are some of the things that we have done to this date. On top of that, the Ministry of Education has also prepared a guide to collect the data for students with disabilities
Wow.
across the nation, because without identifying really how big is this problem of kids that have learning disabilities, we will never be able to start to address the problem. Now, all of these things are mitigating the more symptomatic issues, but with learning disabilities and special needs, most developing countries are not even aware of how big the problem is. A huge amount of special needs are still being misdiagnosed or mislabeled as simply problematic children, or they are just slow to learn, and they are not getting the proper identification. And so actually the only way to solve and address the needs of these special needs is by addressing the teacher training to begin with. Because no matter how many special needs schools you build, it will never ever be able to contain the volume of the students with special needs and learning disabilities. And so the only way to truly find a scalable way to address this is by ensuring that when a teacher becomes a teacher, they are equipped with the skills to be able to identify and to be able to specially address the needs of special needs children. So that's the only really long-term solution to this issue. The teachers that teach in any school need to be prepared to be able to identify and help special needs students. And so I think, inclusiveness is a very, very big problem that needs to be tackled one step at a time. We have gender inclusivity issues, we have economic inclusivity issues, we have regional inequity issues that we're all trying to tackle one by one. For the regional inequity, I think we place a big amount of hope in investing in internet access and ensuring internet and electricity access to be able to not level the playing field in terms of it's suddenly going to miraculously improve learning, but it will give them equal access to the type of content and material and the type of teachers and teacher trainers that will be able to guide them and improve their skill set. So technology plays a pivotal role in solving this inequity problem. And when we're talking about inclusion, I just want to remind the forum that in Indonesia, what we mean by inclusion is it can be very, very diverse in our sense. And we have inequity issues, inclusiveness, non-inclusiveness issues across a variety of dimensions.
That's really very comprehensive overview, Your Excellency, Minister Nadiem. We are very lucky to have you as our leader in education and culture with such a great insightful knowledge to how to tackle these big inclusivity challenges. But I really like also that you are developing a database for understanding the spatial differences and also the emphasis on socio-economic differences, improving the testing, making sure no one is left behind. That's really a challenge for all of us. So if I can continue with the question, Your Excellency, you mentioned we are in this COVID-19 situation, which is a big challenge for the whole world. There are 1.6 billion learners around the world who have been affected in more than 190 countries. And Indonesia is also one of those countries facing this huge challenge. And the colleagues who have joined us, they will also say similar things. Under the leadership of President Jokowi and under your leadership as the Minister of Education and Culture, we hear that there are a lot of emphasis on making sure there is effective spending mechanisms during this COVID period, making sure education does not stop and the teaching and learning processes continue. Would you like to share with us that during COVID, what are those special spending mechanisms and the special measures which you have been leading, which is taking Indonesia through this difficult period, making sure no one's learning stops?
Yeah, this has been, I think for any government, one of the most difficult issues to address. How do you balance the need? How do you balance the trade-off or the risk of an entire generation, missing out on learning that could be permanent in impact versus the short-term health concerns of COVID? We've learned very quickly by discussing with other ministers in all kinds of countries, not just developing countries, that no matter which way you look at it, online learning is something that takes years and years to adapt. And there is no one, and I would, I would stake my, I firmly believe that online learning is at this stage not yet comparable to offline learning and going to classrooms. So we're experiencing a universal decline in quality of learning right now, no matter how much access to technology you have. The psychological impact online learning is having on kids, again, not just in Indonesia, in the West, the loneliness that they have, not being able to see their friends, the lack of interactivity, being stuck 6-7 hours in front of a computer trying to follow your class. You just cannot, you cannot transform something in a matter of months in a mode that takes many, many years, if not decades, to change a mode of learning to optimize the technological product. So the government of Indonesia, we took a very multi-dimensional approach here. We did want to prioritize the health and safety of our students first. That's for sure. But then very quickly, we realized that not everyone was able to do online learning. So we had this choice of, what do we do? Do we see everything from a unidimensional health perspective, or do we take into account the generational loss of no learning can have for a lot of the students in the disadvantaged areas? So we very quickly learned that about 88% of our poorest regions that are most, most isolated in terms of infrastructure, technology, etc., are in our green and yellow zones in terms of COVID risk. We have a zoning system for COVID risk ranging from green all the way to red. And so what we did was we very quickly took that decision to allow using shifting and much more tight health protocols to allow face-to-face schools in the green and yellow zones, which happen to be most of them happen to be the outer region areas. So we really had to save them first and allow them to continue, because really online learning was really not an option for most of them. Either they have very unreliable signal, or they cannot afford quota data costs that have skyrocketed because of online learning, or they have even more basic issues and issues around electricity stability. So forget about internet. Some of these regions don't even have stable electricity. So really the challenges in those remote areas were mounting. So we really prioritize letting them go back to school first, using very tight health protocols to do that first. Outside of that, we did a few other things. We also realized for those outer regions that they could not depend purely on whatever online learning platform their school was using. So we decided to go on national TV and create segments out of our national TV station, which is the government-owned TV station, to actually have educational content, both curriculum-based educational content, as well as some cultural and edutainment aspects, some of which is for teachers. So we launched that, and it was unexpectedly, it was a hit. We have so many people watching educational TV that now the idea is like, how can we have a dedicated channel, and how do we increase the number of hours for educational TV? So TV was a very pleasant surprise at how quick the take-up was on TV-based education. The other thing that we did was we very quickly realized that given the diversity of needs of all these different schools, we had to take a strong position over how we were going to use the centrally allocated budget for schools. Previously, we would always create sections or allocations for every school. This percent, you can only use this percent for teacher salary. You can only use this percent for equipment. You can only use this percent for buying digital equipment, and so on. So we took a very strong stance and decided to completely relax the ability to spend, because in some schools, the crisis was suddenly where we had teachers that were contract teachers that were being paid, way below minimum wage. They had to be able to survive in order to continue to teach the kids. right? And because there were no extra lessons that they can do, there was no additional income that they could have, schools can use that money to support those teachers. In other schools, what they really needed was laptops or tablets in order to do distance learning and lend them out to their kids. And so if we started breaking all these things, and some schools, they needed data to subsidize data for their students that can't afford it, or for their teachers that can't afford it. So there was such a huge diversity of needs that we decided to basically open the Dana BOS, which is the budget that we send directly to schools, but with clear reporting and accountability systems, but not to allocate certain funds for certain things, because this was a crisis situation. And so a lot of the schools really appreciated that, and were able to deliver on their urgent needs right away, especially for schools that want to reopen again. They could use that for preparing for the health protocols, etc. Outside of that, we also decided that private schools were just not getting the help that they needed. So we had another allocated budget that we dedicated for private schools that were really struggling, because a lot of parents were not able to pay tuition, or unwilling to pay tuition because they did not see the value in online learning. So the private schools are also experiencing an institutional economic crisis because of the lack of tuition being paid by the parents. On higher education, we immediately took a step to create a regulatory framework for the delay, the reduction or mitigation of tuition fees across the national universities, because the rectors or the presidents of the universities were asking, like, please give us a regulatory framework to do this. We want to do it, but we need the regulatory. So we immediately released a ministerial decree that basically stipulated that all of these relaxations are legal. And on top of that, we also administered a pretty significant budget to help basically with the tuition fees of university students. So it was a bit of a massive kind of undergoing. The last big chunk that we did outside of the budgetary reforms that we did was we actually went ahead and designed an emergency curriculum. This would be something that would normally take 3 years to do, 2-3 years, and we had to do it in 3 months. So it was quite an undertaking. And to be able to dramatically simplify the curriculum to really focus on the essential competencies that are essential for moving to the next stage. So that instead of going broad, where teachers are forced at the same time to cover everything and adapt at the same time to this new mode of learning, it was impossible for teachers. You're just going to end up having teachers teach everything in a non-optimal way. So instead, what we did was, in this new emergency curriculum, we really dramatically reduced the essential competencies so that teachers could go deep and give them the breathing room to adapt to this new mode of learning. So that was a big thing. Connected to that, one final point, we also finally realized how big of a role parents played in the success of online learning. Mm-hmm. And so for elementary school and early childhood, what we did was we created specific modules with a specific emphasis actually on parents and what their roles were. So the parents received worksheets, the parents received activity, and giving the schools the legal framework to say that if you use this together with the parents, you are 100% compliant on national curriculum regulations. So for early childhood and for elementary school, we created modules specifically for parents that teachers can guide parents to do this at home in their immediate environment.
That's really wonderful journey. But really, the challenge was huge, considering the population, first of all, of Indonesia. It's not a trivial system, as you said, the fourth largest education system in the world, and so many learners in all those islands. So congratulations for this great effort, right from building the basics of the infrastructure with the television and all the way bringing to the teachers, as well as building capacity for the learners as well as their parents. I have a final area to discuss with you, Your Excellency, and it would be of great importance for all member states of UNESCO to also learn. Education is an effort which needs multi-stakeholders to work together. So, of course, the government of Indonesia is doing a great job for everyone in Indonesia, but it may not be possible without bringing the NGOs. Can you please share your experience with us, how the NGOs and private sector has been working with you during this COVID and before COVID as well, making sure that learning never stops? Thank you, dear Excellency.
Well, thank you. I think that, first to note, the team that has come in to the ministry when I joined are a composition of a variety of NGO experience, public and private sector experience. So the kind of the new leadership team of the ministry are composed of experts, both internal within the ministry, but external as well. Experts in the fields of education, in the field of social welfare, experts in the field of human capital development. So the ministry itself is a pretty renewed ministry with a lot of new faces in it as well, and a whole new leadership, because we had to merge two ministries together, and during that process there were a lot of new reselections. So there's a lot of now new blood in the ministry today. The second thing is we never do anything alone in the ministry. Literally every piece of policy that we have a huge amount of policy consultants, policy stakeholders from NGOs, both representing in local government level and central government level, that are constantly feeding us information and helping us think through policies and monitoring the policies that we implement. So there's no other way of doing this in education, because there is no single answer in education. It's very different than other fields. I think in government, education, I think, has the highest level of complexity. Even determining what is the metric of success in education is probably the hardest job in education, let alone deciding what are the correct initiatives and how do you allocate resources towards them. So I think that having the perspective of NGOs, having the perspective of multilateral organizations, sharing these stories, because we're all learning together as we do this, can really deliver much better results. We have a program that we just launched, which basically is an incubator program that allows a lot of NGOs and nonprofit organizations to perform whatever it is they do to transform schools, and to measure the outcomes on numeracy, literacy, and the key output metrics in a school, and then be able to see if those metrics moved, like what did those organizations do. So that initiative that we just launched recently, that we will launch for next year, is exactly to the point of trying to see what are the best strategies and best innovations that exist out there through these organizations, and have us as a ministry be able to observe, measure, and then implement it on a national scale if it is successful. So we take a very evidence-based approach in what we're all trying to do. 5 years is a very, very short time in the education space. Most of the reforms that, to see the impact take, 10, 20 years in the education space. So it is a highly challenging environment, notwithstanding the pandemic that has just happened, which kind of, pulled back a huge amount of the acceleration that we'd already gained. So it was already a difficult field to begin with, given our geographical and infrastructure challenges that we face as a country. But the optimistic part is that, especially during this time of crisis, I think a huge amount of, and this is also thanks to all the NGOs and multilateral organizations that are feeding us advice and strategies, etc. There is much more momentum during the pandemic crisis to change things for the better. So there's a lot more leeway and a lot more, I think, willingness to make fundamental changes in how we administer an educational system in Indonesia. And so I'm optimistic. I know that in the short term, learning outcomes will suffer. That's inevitable, I think, anywhere in the world right now. But I believe, and I'm optimistic, that coming out of this pandemic, we have an unprecedented number of parents that finally have looked for the first time at the curriculum of their kids. We have an unprecedented number of teachers and parents that have struggled and experimented with technology platforms to try to find what's relevant for them, what's not. Never before in the history of Indonesia or the world have we seen this. For the first time, I think, in the world, we are realizing also the limits of technology and how important face-to-face learning is and how important the role of parents are in the education space. So all of this, I think, are positive realizations that the pandemic has created that can be used as momentum to create transformational change. It is impossible to change an educational system in 5 years, but what is possible is to get to the tipping point of change, to get to that point whereby there's enough agents of change installed in each layer of the system that the changes will be irreversible.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Those were the areas we wanted to discuss with you, which are important to all member states of UNESCO. On behalf of UNESCO and the colleagues who have joined us from many different countries, we wish to thank you for your insights. We wish to also congratulate Indonesia and for your leadership in the continuity of learning before COVID and during COVID. Of course, we really like your optimism with the positive aspects which are there, with the better understanding of our barriers and more engagement with the students, teachers, with the NGOs and the learners themselves also helping, and the role of technology which is being played. So UNESCO will continue to work with the government of Indonesia, with the Ministry of Education and Culture, as well as the wider UN system. We are really looking forward to Indonesia to be a leader in the world, which it is already, for South-South cooperation, and also for us to support wherever possible, where you see us fit in supporting. So thanking all the participants and Your Excellency for your time during your many other pressing demands on your time. So with this, I would like to close this first session, and we all thank you, Your Excellency, Minister Nadiem Makarim. We are very lucky to have your dynamic leadership. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. An honor to be here. Thank you.